So, today I want to talk about the cops being called on a 9-year-old black girl. A little girl by the name of Bobby Wilson made it her mission to help her community in Caldwell, New Jersey. She had researched a recipe to kill lanternflies, an invasive species that sucks the life out of trees and could have significant environmental impacts if they are allowed to spread. After figuring out the proper ingredients and mixing them in a spray bottle, she went out on her mission. While outside, in front of her own home, spraying these invasive insects, something that should have been a wholesome moment of this young girl learning about biology, environmentalism, and helping her community, Bobby Wilson was forced to grow up far too soon. This young girl had the police called on her by her very own neighbor. To relieve the tension, I feel the need at this point to let people know that she was not physically harmed during the incident. And thankfully, the cop is said to have only driven by, and from what I'm also understanding, didn't even say a word to her. Nothing escalated beyond that. But the reality of being black in the United States makes these situations eerie, scary, and traumatizing. And that is still something worth talking about. The man who called the police on this young girl is named Gordon Lausch. Lausch is a former councilman of Caldwell and is the co-chairman and treasurer of the Caldwell Republican Party. Instead of just going out to talk to his neighbors of 8 years, who literally live right across the street from him, this man decided to call the police, and on that phone call, he used some rather telling language. Quote, "There's a little black woman walking, spraying stuff on the sidewalks and trees. I don't know what the hell she's doing. It scares me though." Lausch is also mentioned in his phone call that Wilson was wearing a hood and said that she was a real small woman, you can't miss her. The child is still under 5 feet tall, according to her family. Now, it's really frustrating to me that they even had to mention her height. She's a 9-year-old girl who is doing stuff in front of her own home. But when we look at that phone call, the language of that call was that of a threat. A threat that was meant to weaponize the police against a 9-year-old girl. This man was a councilman and a Republican on top of it. He knows how this system works. He knew the exact right code words to use to imply the suspicion and danger of a black person guilty of the crime of walking while black in an otherwise white neighborhood. He used the word hood, emphasized her blackness, and mentioned he was scared. He was scared of a black girl, who he labeled as a young woman in a textbook case of adultification to make her seem like a bigger threat. These words are the words that get young black children harmed and killed. Now, there is a lot to unpack there. But before I do want to put it front and center that this experience was traumatizing for this young girl. In fact, she was afraid to go outside the very next day, and was feeling fear for at least 2 weeks since the incident. This fear is something that Lausch's attorney openly dismissed by stating, all the cop did was drive by, but her mother's assertion that her daughter is now afraid of the cops is absurd. There is nothing absurd about this child being traumatized by having the cops called on her. It is absolutely scary, especially given that we live in a world where Bobby sees all these other black children and adults on the news being killed by police officers for doing nothing wrong. So when this car rolled up beside her, she was immediately frightened because she did nothing wrong. No kid should be scared in their own town on their own street. And yet, she was. And why wouldn't she be afraid when this type of thing happens far too often? In fact, we have a situation like what happened in 2021, where police in Rochester, New York, pepper sprayed and handcuffed a 9-year-old girl that they were supposed to protect and insulted her on top of it. Or when Syracuse police aggressively detained a young 10-year-old for allegedly stealing a bag of chips, when the neighbor even offered to pay for it just to get the cops off the child's back. Or when Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, was shot and killed by the police after the exact same type of language of fear was expressed during the 911 call that led to his death. In fact, this fear keeps leading people to call the cops on people of color for seemingly no reason. Like the case where 2 black men were arrested for trespassing as they waited inside a Philadelphia Starbucks for a business partner. The men later said that they had been inside the Starbucks for mere minutes before the store's manager called 911 because they sat down without ordering anything. Or when a black woman was arrested simply for having a dispute on a restaurant bill. Or when two black women golfed and, in the eyes of the owner, were said to have gone too slow, and thus the cops were called on them. Or when a white woman called the cops for two indigenous teenagers seemingly for no reason because they were just at a event. Or the instance where a young woman called the police on a trio of black filmmakers simply because they didn't wave or smile to make her feel safe. I believe the Washington Post actually said it best when they said it is naive to believe that white callers are not aware of race privileges when they call the cops on suspicious black people. They're weaponizing their fears in a form of violence that buttresses a white supremacist system. When white people see black people doing the exact same sort of daily activities that they are doing, especially in spaces they deem to be theirs, it frightens them so badly that they call 911. It is worth understanding and mentioning that if she were a little white girl, she probably would not have had the cops called on her that day. And when these young adults identify these young black children that they fear so much, and that they often assume that these children are older, just like what happened in this instance, they often mistake young children for adults. This treatment of children as more mature than they actually are is known as adultification. And this adultification, much like what happened to Bobby Wilson, forces black children to take on adult socio-emotional roles while they are still children and robs them of their childhood. Now, in a report called Girlhood Interrupted, the erasure of black girls' childhoods, it was revealed that adults typically believe the following: that black girls seem older than white girls of the same age, that black girls need less nurturing than white girls, that black girls need less protection than white girls, that black girls need to be supported less than white girls, that black girls need to be comforted less than white girls, that black girls are more independent than white girls, that black girls know more about adult topics than white girls, and that black girls know more about sex than white girls. Black girls are girls, just like white girls. There's not a significant difference outside of the fact that their experiences of being black put them in more harm and danger in American society. They otherwise are, in fact, the same age. They have the same types of nurturing. They need the same types of protection. They need to be comforted the same. Well, in different ways that are specific to their own needs, but in the same levels and manners, they need to be comforted and cared for. They're not more independent. They don't overwhelmingly know more. They are not adults. They are girls. And that needs to be recognized and understood. And the fact that so many people, adults across the spectrum of people, can make this mistake at identifying black girls and adultifying them to be older than they are is a massive problem. Now, according to the American Psychological Association, a similar phenomena actually happens with black boys. Black boys as young as 10 may not be viewed in the same light of childhood innocence as their white peers, but are instead more likely to be mistaken as older, to be perceived as guilty, and face police violence if accused of a crime. Meanwhile, a recent study from North Carolina State University finds that the older an adult thinks a black child is, the more likely the adult is to incorrectly view the child as angry. There was no similar shifts in adults' perceptions of white children's emotions. This study shows again that black children are more likely than white children to be seen as angry even when they are not angry, which has ramifications for receiving unfair consequences. Unfair consequences that in this case include fearful and racist white people calling the cops on their neighbor's 9-year-old girl for trying to help their community. This little girl has experienced a traumatic event, and it never even required the physical harm that could have been caused by that police officer if events had gone differently or she lived in a different area. The fear of those sorts of stories that have been on TV for this young girl have become all the more real, as it only requires a neighbor to see her as potentially dangerous and to describe her as a violent adult in order to scare her and make her feel less safe in her own neighborhood. This was a situation that forced her to grow up far too quickly. That said, I do hope that this young girl's passion and that her care of the environment and that her interest in the world outweighs this terrible experience, and that this continues to fuel her far more than this one incident, and that she continues to explore things like lanternflies and pursues more STEM based research, as she clearly has a passion for it. And it would be a benefit to the world if someone like her were to continue her passion rather than succumb to fear. So with that said, if you've learned something here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as consider joining my Discord where we talk about conversations like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as it goes a long way for me to continue to produce content like this. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. So with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.